World War II in the Pacific began with the Japanese belief that they had the right to control all of Asia because of manifest destiny. Manifest destiny is defined as a doctrine or belief that expansion was both justified and inevitable. The flag shown in the video looks like a sun because of the fact that the Japanese thought they had descended from the sun goddess. Japan planted a bomb on the railroad north of the Chinese city Mukden. After the bomb exploded, the Japanese blamed the Chinese army and invaded Manchuria. After gaining all of Manchuria, Japan makes them a puppet regime, which means they seem to be independent but are still in fact dependent on an outside power. Japan leaves the League of Nations after China confronts them about the unfairness of the attack. Many times, Western nations attempted to prevent Japanese expansion by issuing the Washington Naval Conference, agreements at the Paris Peace Conference, and the U.S.-Japanese Exclusion Act. The Chinese begin to fight back in the Second Sino-Japanese War, but later gain international support as the Japanese conduct a brutal attack on the city of Nanking. By this point, the Japanese have gained most of East Asia. Japan was very isolated, and one of their main reasons for imperialization was the search for resources. The U.S. placed an embargo on trade to Japan, which resulted in Japan being in major desperation for oil. This is because it played a big role in their naval power. Having a strong navy was important for Japan to imperialize. This is the major difference between the Europe and Pacific during World War II, because during the Pacific there was a larger distance to cover from the U.S. all the way to Japan. The solution to their problem for resources was to drop a bomb on Pearl Harbor, a U.S. naval base in Hawaii. Isoroku Yamamoto planned his attack to sink battleships and crush American morale. However, it did the opposite. The bombing killed more than 2,300 Americans and gave Americans a reason to fight back.
The plan to attack Pearl Harbor was conducted by Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku, which aimed to destroy the U.S. Pacific Fleet at its base. The purpose of attacking Pearl Harbor stemmed from the competing interest in Chinese markets and Asian natural resources with the U.S. In response to the Japanese aggression, the U.S. Congress placed restrictions on business with Japan. In 1939, President Franklin D. Roosevelt ordered the U.S. Pacific Fleet to move from California to Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The move of the Pacific Fleet was seen as a threat to the Japanese and their desire for expansion in the Pacific. A Pacific War had been discussed by both Japanese and U.S. militaries during this period within the Japanese government. There were many hawkish politicians and military leaders. Many of them believed war between Japan and the U.S. was inevitable. The Japanese solution to this inevitable war was to attack first. The Japanese had high hopes of crushing the will of the American people, and that it would lead the Americans to immediately give up. The Japanese surprise attack on the U.S. was maintained by strict radio silence of ships around Hitokapu Bay, north of the Hawaiian island of Oahu. After months of planning and practice, the Japanese launched their first attack. At around 6 a.m. on Sunday, December 7, 1941, the first wave of Japanese planes lifted off from the carriers, followed by a second wave an hour later. By the time the attack was over, every battleship in Pearl Harbor had sustained significant damage, mainly the USS Arizona. The USS Arizona held 1,000 men trapped inside when an 1,800-pound bomb smashed through the deck, exploding and eventually sinking. Battleships were no longer the important naval vessel, but it was the rise of aircraft carriers. The Japanese attack destroyed 20 American ships and more than 300 airplanes. Also, 2,403 sailors, soldiers, and civilians were killed, and about 1,000 people wounded. The Japanese failed to cripple the Pacific Fleet. The assault left the base's most vital onshore facilities, like oil storage depots, still intact. The U.S. Navy was able to recover from the assault very quickly because of this. President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed a joint session of the U.S. Congress on December 8th, a day after the Pearl Harbor attack. He said, "Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. This inspired the American people, and for the first time during years of discussion and debate, the Americans were united in their determination to go to war." On December 8th, Congress approved Roosevelt's declaration of war on Japan. A couple of days later, the Axis powers of Germany and Italy also declared war on the U.S.
After Pearl Harbor, Americans were even more determined to fight against the Axis. FDR asked for a declaration of war. Doolittle's raid boosts American morale even more as bombers attacked Tokyo and other cities. This was an act that showed Japan that the U.S. would for sure fight back, although it did little damage. In May 1942, the U.S. protected Australia from the Japanese in the Battle of the Coral Sea. The U.S. also had a victory on Midway Island, in which Americans cracked Japanese code and allowed them to move in an offensive position. During the war in the Pacific, the U.S. used a strategy called island hopping, which is defined as the travel from one island to another. Through travel, the U.S. used each island as a base for bombers to get closer to their target. One of the battles on these islands was the Battle of Guadalcanal. The U.S. had performed a surprise attack, and Japan was forced to retreat. The Battle of Iwo Jima was one in which the U.S. captured the Iwo Jima island. The Battle of Okinawa was the last step before the U.S. was able to invade Japan completely. At this battle, suicide was occurring rapidly, and the U.S. was unsure if anyone would even face surrender.
Perhaps even worse than Pearl Harbor was the surrender of the American and Filipino troops at Bataan. Japan invaded the Philippines and within a month captured Manila, the capital of the Philippines. The U.S. Filipino Army had a lack of naval and air support. Forces were forced to surrender due to starvation and disease. In all of American history, this was the largest surrender. Japanese guards rounded up approximately 75,000 troops and forced them to march 65 miles to San Fernando. These troops walked in what was called a Bataan Death March to prisoner of war camps. The Samurai Code was an unwritten Japanese code of honor. The Japanese had too much pride to surrender, and the idea of kamikazes came as a result of this. These were pilots that committed suicide in contrast to surrendering. They drove their planes into Allied warships that would cause a lot of damage to their enemy. Most kamikazes were loaded with bombs and extra gasoline tanks. At Okinawa, these aircrafts caused the greatest losses ever suffered by the U.S. Navy in a single battle. President Truman, followed by the death of FDR, officially introduced the end of the war through an atomic bomb. The U.S. warned Japan to surrender. However, it is said that Truman did not give the Japanese enough time to get the message or send a message back. The U.S. dropped bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which killed many, many innocent lives. The use of this bomb is a very controversial topic to this day. 5 days later, Japan surrendered, and World War II was officially over.